The first thing I saw when I stepped back into my grandmother's house was her knees on the kitchen floor. She was scrubbing the tiles with a rag that looked older than the house itself. The smell of bleach filled the air, sharp and sterile. Nothing like the warm scent of cinnamon and baked apples that used to live in that kitchen when I was growing up. For a moment, I honestly thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. My grandmother, Eleanor Carter, was the one who built this house alongside my grandfather more than 40 years earlier. Every board, every window, every rose bush outside had her fingerprints on it. But there she was, on her knees, cleaning the floor like someone who had been told to do it. Behind her, in the living room, my Uncle Raymond leaned back on the couch with his feet resting on the coffee table that used to belong to my grandfather. His wife Denise sat beside him, scrolling through her phone like she had always lived there. Then my grandmother looked up. Her eyes moved slowly across my face, studying me the way you study a stranger who has just walked through the wrong door. And in a soft, polite voice, she said the words that made my stomach drop. "Can I help you?" "Miss." She didn't recognize me. Not her own granddaughter. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of the house I had grown up in, I realized something in this family had gone terribly wrong. I hadn't planned on coming back to Cedar Ridge that week. My life had been in Chicago for years. A small apartment, a demanding job, constant meetings and deadlines that never seemed to slow down. Like a lot of people who leave small towns, I kept promising myself I would visit more often. But time has a way of slipping past you when you're busy building a life somewhere else. Still, I called Grandma every Sunday. Those phone calls always sounded the same. She would tell me about her garden, about the birds nesting in the oak tree behind the house, about the weather, the neighbors, and sometimes the little pies she baked, even though there were fewer people around to eat them. Her voice always sounded calm, content. Never once did she mention that anything was wrong. That was why I decided to surprise her. A random Wednesday afternoon. No warning. Just a long drive back to the town where I had spent most of my childhood. Cedar Ridge looked almost exactly the same when I arrived. The diner on Main Street still had the same red neon sign. The grocery store was still run by the same family that had owned it for decades. Even the single traffic light in the center of town still blinked slowly like it had nowhere urgent to be. Small towns have a strange way of freezing time. But something felt different when I turned onto Maple Street. Our house stood at the end of the block, just like it always had. White siding, blue shutters, a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Yet the garden looked wrong. Grandma's roses had always been her pride. She used to trim them carefully every week, making sure every bush looked perfect. Now the roses were wild, tangled, almost neglected. I remember telling myself she must have been tired lately. Maybe gardening had become too much work. I tried not to think about it too much as I walked up the porch steps. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual in a place like Cedar Ridge. I stepped inside and immediately felt something I couldn't quite explain. The house didn't feel like ours anymore. The furniture had been rearranged. The old quilt Grandma kept on the couch was gone. Even the hallway looked strange. The family photos that had always covered the walls were missing. In their place were cheap, decorative paintings that looked like they had been picked up at a discount store. That uneasy feeling in my chest started growing. Then I heard the sound coming from the kitchen. A slow, repetitive scrubbing. That was when I walked in and saw her on the floor. For a moment I thought maybe she had dropped something. But the bucket beside her told a different story. She wasn't picking something up. She was cleaning. The kind of cleaning you do when someone expects the floor to shine. Her hands looked red from the chemicals. Her shoulders seemed smaller than I remembered. Like the weight of the years had finally settled on them. "Grandma," I said quietly. She turned slowly. Her eyes landed on me. But they didn't light up the way they used to. Instead, there was hesitation. Polite confusion. The expression you give someone you've never met before. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "Do you need something?" Before I could answer, a voice came from behind me. "Well, look who decided to come back." I turned around and saw my Uncle Raymond sitting in the living room. I hadn't seen him in almost 4 years. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. His feet rested on the coffee table that my grandfather had built with his own hands. Denise barely looked up from her phone. "Oh," she said casually. "You're Emily." "Right. Not welcome home." "Not, it's been a long time." Just a bored recognition. I looked back toward the kitchen. Grandma had already lowered her head again. The rag moved slowly across the tile. Raymond snapped his fingers toward the kitchen. "Eleanor," he called. "When you're done with that, bring us some iced tea." He didn't say Mom. He didn't say Grandma. He said Eleanor, like she was someone who worked for him. Something tightened in my chest as I walked toward the living room. "Why is Grandma cleaning the floor?" I asked. Raymond shrugged like the answer was obvious. "She helps around the house." "Helps." The word sounded wrong. Denise leaned forward slightly. "She lives here with us now," she said. "So everyone contributes, lives here with us. Not the other way around. Not the way it had always been." I glanced down the hallway again. The picture of my grandparents on their wedding day was gone. The photo of me sitting on Grandma's lap on the porch when I was 5 years old was gone too. It felt like someone had erased our family from the house. I walked back into the kitchen slowly. Grandma was still scrubbing the floor. I knelt beside her. "Grandma," I said softly. "It's me, Emily." She looked up again. Her eyes searched my face. For a moment I thought I saw recognition. But then it faded. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "My memory isn't very good these days." My stomach dropped. Because suddenly this didn't feel like a strange situation anymore. It felt like something had been taken from her. And as I stood there watching my grandmother clean the floor of the house she once owned, I realized this family drama had only just begun. I stood in the kitchen watching my grandmother scrub the floor long after the sound of Raymond's television filled the living room. The rag moved slowly across the tiles. The same small motion again and again. It felt wrong to watch her like that. Like something in the natural order of the world had been turned upside down. My grandmother had always been the strongest person in our family. When my grandfather died, she kept the house together, the garden alive, the family traditions going. Now she looked smaller somehow. "Older, Grandma," I said gently. She paused and looked up at me, the rag still in her hand. "Yes, dear." The word dear sounded polite, distant, like something she would say to a stranger in the grocery store. "Why are you cleaning the floor?" I asked quietly. For a moment she didn't answer. Instead, she glanced toward the living room where Raymond and Denise were sitting. Only then did she speak. "Raymond and Denise take care of the house now," she said softly. "I just help when I can." The sentence landed strangely in my ears. Take care of the house. I looked around the kitchen again. The cabinets were the same. The old clock on the wall still ticked slowly above the stove. But something in the way she said it felt wrong. "You mean they help you?" I asked. Grandma shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "They're the owners now." Owners. The word sat heavily between us. Before I could ask another question, Raymond's voice echoed from the living room. "Eleanor, did you finish yet?" Grandma quickly lowered her head again and returned to scrubbing the floor. A few seconds later, Raymond walked into the kitchen. He stopped when he saw us talking. "Well," he said with a dry smile, "looks like you two are catching up." His tone sounded casual, but his eyes studied me carefully. "When did you get back into town?" he asked. "About an hour ago," I replied. He nodded slowly. "You could have called first," he said. "We weren't expecting company." "Company?" I had grown up in this house. I ignored the comment. "Grandma just told me something interesting," I said. "She said you own the house now." Raymond leaned against the counter like the conversation didn't matter. "That's right," he said. "Things changed while you were gone." Denise walked in behind him carrying her phone. "It happened a few years ago," she added casually. "Your grandma decided it was easier if Raymond handled the property." Grandma stayed silent on the floor. I watched her carefully. She kept her eyes down, like someone who didn't want to be part of the conversation. "When did that happen?" I asked. Raymond answered almost instantly. About 3 years ago. Denise nodded in agreement. Right around then. 3 years? The number echoed in my head. Raymond must have noticed the pause because he quickly changed the subject. So how long are you staying in Cedar Ridge? He asked. Not sure yet, I said. He studied my face for another moment before shrugging. Well, just remember this isn't really your house anymore. The words were delivered calmly, almost politely, but the meaning was clear. I stepped back into the hallway without answering. The house felt quieter there. I walked slowly past the empty walls where our family photos used to hang. The frames were gone. Every memory that had once lived in that hallway had disappeared. I stepped outside to the front porch and sat down on the old wooden swing. The evening air was cooler than I expected. Across the street, Mrs. Collins was watering her flowers. She looked up when she noticed me. Emily, she called out. I smiled and walked over to the fence. It's been a while, I said. She shook her head slowly. Well, look at you, she said. Back in town. Just visiting, I replied. Mrs. Collins glanced toward the house. Her expression changed slightly. You came back to see your grandma? Of course. She hesitated. Then she leaned closer to the fence. You didn't know what happened, she asked quietly. What do you mean? Her voice dropped lower. 3 years ago, your grandma got very sick, she said. Ended up in the hospital for a while. I felt my stomach tighten. I remember she mentioned surgery, I said. Mrs. Collins nodded. Yes, but there were a lot of people coming and going while she was there. What kind of people? Lawyers, she said. Your uncle was there almost every day with paperwork. Paperwork. The word stuck in my mind. She seemed confused at the time. Mrs. Collins added gently. I always wondered if she really understood everything that was happening. I thanked her and walked slowly back toward the house. 3 years ago. Grandma in the hospital. Raymond handling paperwork. The same year the house suddenly belonged to him. When I stepped inside again, the house felt different, quieter. But as I walked down the hallway, I heard Raymond's voice coming from the den. He was on the phone. I stopped when I heard the words. Don't worry, Raymond said calmly. The property will be ready to sell soon. Sell? I froze beside the wall. Once everything is finalized, we'll move forward. He continued. The land is worth too much now to wait. I stood there in silence, listening to the rest of the conversation fade into the room. Sell the house. Sell the land. Sell the place my grandparents had spent their lives building. And suddenly the strange feeling I had when I walked through the door made perfect sense. This wasn't just a misunderstanding inside a complicated family. This was betrayal. I stood in the hallway long after Raymond finished his phone call. Sell the property. The words echoed in my mind like a warning bell that refused to stop ringing. My grandfather had built that house with his own hands. My grandmother had planted every tree in the yard. That land wasn't just real estate. It was our family's history. Yet Raymond had said the word sell like he was talking about an old car. I walked quietly back to the living room before he could notice me standing there. Raymond came out of the den a minute later and glanced at me with suspicion. You look tired, he said. Long drive, I replied. He nodded slowly, but his eyes lingered on me a second longer than necessary. For the rest of the evening, I didn't say much. Denise talked about some television show while Raymond drank iced tea and occasionally checked his phone. Grandma moved silently around the kitchen, cleaning dishes that didn't even need cleaning. Every time I looked at her, my anger grew a little stronger. But I didn't confront Raymond. Not yet. Instead, I waited. Later that night, the house became quiet. Raymond and Denise went upstairs, and the lights in the hallway turned off one by one. I stayed awake. There was something I remembered from when I was younger. Grandma used to keep important documents in a wooden chest in the attic. Old property papers, insurance forms, tax records, things she never trusted leaving anywhere else. If the truth about the house existed anywhere, it might still be there. I climbed the attic stairs slowly, careful not to let the wood creak too loudly beneath my feet. The attic smelled like dust and old memories. Moonlight slipped through the small window near the roof, just enough to see shapes in the darkness. The chest was still there, pushed against the far wall. I knelt beside it and lifted the lid. Inside were folders stacked neatly together. Some were yellow with age. Others were newer, but still carefully organized in Grandma's handwriting. I started flipping through them. Old insurance forms, utility records, property tax documents going back years. Then I found something that made my stomach tighten. A property transfer document. I pulled it closer to the window where the moonlight was stronger. At the top of the page was the address of the house on Maple Street. Below that was the new owner's name. Raymond Carter. My chest felt suddenly heavy. The document was dated 3 years ago, the same year Grandma had been hospitalized. For a moment I just stared at the page, trying to make sense of it. Then I looked at the signature at the bottom. Eleanor Carter. My grandmother's name, but something about it looked wrong. Grandma's handwriting had always been steady and elegant. She used to write birthday cards in beautiful cursive letters that almost looked printed. This signature was different. The lines were uneven, the letters shaky, almost like the person holding the pen had been weak or disoriented. I reached into the chest again and found an older document. A property tax form from years earlier. Grandma's signature there was completely different. Confident, smooth. The difference between the two signatures was impossible to ignore. A cold thought crossed my mind. What if she hadn't really known what she was signing? I read the transfer document more carefully. That's when I noticed another name on the page. A witness signature. Someone who had supposedly watched Grandma sign the document. But the name meant nothing to me. It wasn't our family lawyer. It wasn't anyone I had ever heard Grandma mention. I took out my phone and snapped photos of every page. Then I carefully placed the documents back into the folder and closed the chest. The house was silent as I walked back downstairs. I barely slept that night. The next morning I drove into town before anyone else woke up. Cedar Ridge had only one small law office, the kind that handled wills, property disputes, and small-town legal problems. I sat in my car outside the building for several minutes before finally going inside. The lawyer looked through the photos on my phone quietly. He didn't say anything at first. He just studied the document carefully. Then he leaned back in his chair. "This transfer raises some questions," he said. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "Well, first of all, the signature looks unusual," he replied. I nodded. "I noticed that too." He pointed to the date on the page. "When exactly did your grandmother sign this?" 3 years ago, I said. "Around the time she had surgery?" The lawyer looked at me thoughtfully. "Was she fully aware of what she was signing?" The question sent a chill down my spine. "I'm not sure," I admitted. He folded his hands on the desk. "There are situations where elderly people sign documents while they're sick or medicated," he said carefully. "And sometimes family members take advantage of that." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What would that be called legally?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Potential elder exploitation." The words hung in the air between us. I left the office feeling both hopeful and uneasy at the same time. Hopeful because the document might not be as solid as Raymond believed. Uneasy because if the lawyer was right, the situation inside my family was worse than I had imagined. When I pulled into the driveway later that afternoon, my phone buzzed in my hand. A message from Raymond. "Where are you?" I stared at the screen for a moment before looking up at the house. If Raymond already suspected I was asking questions, the next few days inside that house were going to become a lot more dangerous. Raymond was standing on the porch when I pulled into the driveway. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just leaned against the railing with his arms crossed, watching my car roll slowly toward the house. For a moment I considered turning around and driving away again. Instead, I parked and stepped out like nothing was wrong. "Where'd you disappear to this morning?" he asked. His voice sounded casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Went into town," I said. "Thought I'd see if anything in Cedar Ridge had actually changed." He gave a short laugh. "Not much changes around here." Denise appeared behind him in the doorway. She looked me up and down like she was trying to measure something. "Did you stop by the courthouse while you were out?" she asked lightly. The question caught me off guard. "No," I said calmly. "Why would I?" She shrugged. "Just asking." But the way she said it made the air between us feel heavier. I walked past them into the house. Grandma was in the kitchen again, wiping the counter even though it was already spotless. "Grandma?" I said softly. She looked up and smiled politely. That same distant smile. I waited until Raymond and Denise went back to the living room before speaking again. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked. She nodded and sat down slowly at the kitchen table. I pulled out the chair across from her. "Do you remember signing papers a few years ago?" I asked gently. Her eyebrows tightened in confusion. "What kind of papers?" "About the house." She hesitated. Her fingers twisted together on the table. "Raymond handles those things now," she said quietly. "But do you remember signing anything?" She glanced toward the hallway. Lowering her voice, she whispered, "He said it would make things easier if he managed the house." That wasn't an answer. It was an excuse someone had given her. Before I could press further, Denise walked into the kitchen. "Will this look serious?" she said. Her voice carried a sweetness that felt completely fake. "Just catching up," I replied. Denise leaned against the counter. "You know," she said, "it's interesting that you suddenly show up after being gone for years." I raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" She shrugged. "Nothing. Just that people tend to come back when there's money involved." The accusation was subtle, but the message was clear. Raymond appeared in the doorway a moment later. "What's going on in here?" he asked. "Emily's asking a lot of questions," Denise said. Raymond looked at me. "You planning to stay long?" he asked. "Not sure yet." He nodded slowly. "Well, just remember this isn't really your place anymore." I didn't respond. Dinner that night felt like sitting inside someone else's house. Raymond took the seat at the head of the table. "The same place my grandfather used to sit." Denise brought plates out from the kitchen while Grandma stood quietly near the counter. At one point, Denise turned to her. "Eleanor, can you grab more iced tea?" Grandma stood immediately. No hesitation. No protest. I watched her walk slowly across the room, carrying the pitcher with both hands. Raymond continued talking about something on the news like everything was completely normal. At one point, he casually said, "Once I decide what to do with the property, things will get easier." The property, not the house. Not Grandma's home. Just property. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the back porch. The evening air smelled like fresh grass and distant rain. I looked out across the yard where I used to play when I was a kid. Grandma had taught me how to plant flowers in the corner near the fence. My grandfather had built the wooden swing that still hung from the oak tree. That yard held more memories than I could count. And Raymond was talking about selling it like it was nothing. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes for a moment. Then I heard voices coming from inside. The kitchen window was slightly open. Raymond was talking on the phone. "I told you," he said quietly. "The deal is moving forward." I stood still. "Once the paperwork clears, the property is yours," he continued. "The land is worth a fortune now." My heart started beating faster. Denise's voice joined the conversation. "We just need to move the old woman out first," she said. There was a pause. Then Raymond laughed. "She doesn't even understand what she signed." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I stepped back from the window before they could see me outside. The porch suddenly felt smaller. The air heavier. Back inside the house, I walked straight to the living room and opened my laptop. If Raymond was planning to sell the property, there had to be a reason. I started searching online. It didn't take long before something interesting appeared. A regional development company had been buying land around Cedar Ridge. Several nearby properties had already been purchased. A new commercial project was rumored to be coming to the area. Shopping centers, restaurants, parking lots. The map on the screen showed something that made my stomach drop. Our house sat right in the center of the proposed development zone. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Now it all made sense. Grandma's illness. The paperwork. Raymond suddenly owning the house. And the plan to sell? This wasn't about helping her. It was about money. A lot of money. And for the first time since I walked through the door of that house, I understood the full scale of the betrayal. Raymond hadn't just taken control of the house. He was preparing to cash in on it. And if I didn't stop him, my grandmother would lose the only home she had left. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing Raymond's voice through the kitchen window. The land is worth a fortune now. Move the old woman out first. Those words replayed over and over in my head. By morning, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a family disagreement. This was a plan. And if I wanted to stop it, I needed proof. I drove back into town just after sunrise and went straight to the lawyer's office again. He recognized me immediately when I walked in. "You found something else," he said. I nodded and sat down across from his desk. "I overheard my uncle talking about selling the property," I explained. "There's a development project happening near Maple Street." The lawyer leaned back in his chair, thinking, "That would explain the sudden interest in transferring ownership," he said. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos of the document again. "And my grandmother had surgery that same year," I added. "She was in the hospital." He studied the document carefully. "There's another issue here," he said after a moment. "What? Did your uncle have power of attorney over your grandmother at the time?" I blinked. "I don't know." "If he did," the lawyer continued, "he may have had temporary authority to manage her finances while she was recovering. But that wouldn't give him the right to transfer ownership of her property." The thought made my stomach tighten. "Can we find out if he had that authority?" I asked. He nodded. "Give me a day or two." The next afternoon he called me back. "I found the document," he said. Raymond had been granted power of attorney while Grandma was recovering from surgery. But the document only allowed him to handle bills and temporary financial decisions. It did not give him permission to transfer the house into his own name. That alone was troubling. But the lawyer wasn't finished. "There's more," he said. "Your grandmother's hospital records indicate she was heavily medicated during that period." I stared at the phone in my hand. "If someone signs legal documents while they're under strong medication," he explained, "their ability to fully understand what they're signing can be questioned." The silence on the line lasted several seconds. "That means the transfer could be challenged," I said slowly. "Yes," he replied, "but we'll need evidence." Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table across from Grandma again. Raymond and Denise had gone out to dinner, leaving the house unusually quiet. I spoke carefully. "Grandma, do you remember Raymond bringing papers to the hospital when you were sick?" She frowned. "Trying to think, I remember him visiting," she said. "And the papers?" Her brow tightened as she searched through the fog of old memories. "Yes," she whispered after a moment. "There were papers." "What did he tell you they were?" She looked embarrassed. "He said they were insurance forms," she replied softly. My chest tightened. "Did you read them?" She shook her head slowly. I trusted him. The words hurt more than I expected, because that was exactly what Raymond had counted on. Trust. Later that night, I returned to my laptop. The development company I had found earlier had a public website. I started digging deeper. Corporate filings, property purchases, business connections. After nearly an hour of searching, something caught my attention. One of the project consultants had the same last name as Denise. I clicked the link. My stomach dropped. It was her brother. Denise's brother worked for the development firm, planning to build the retail complex. I leaned back in my chair slowly. The pieces finally snapped together. Grandma became ill. Raymond gained temporary legal authority. The house was transferred into his name. And now Denise's family had connections to the company buying the land. It wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a coordinated scheme. The next morning, I met with the lawyer again and showed him everything I had found. He read through the information carefully. "This strengthens your case," he said. "Between the questionable signature, the hospital records, and the conflict of interest with the developer, we have grounds to challenge the transfer. But if we do that," I said, Raymond will know. The lawyer nodded. Yes. Once we file the case, it becomes a legal dispute. I thought about the house, the porch swing, Grandma's roses outside, everything Raymond planned to sell. Do it, I said. That night the house felt heavier than usual. Raymond watched me closely during dinner. Denise kept whispering things to him when she thought I wasn't looking. They knew something had changed. They just didn't know what yet. Upstairs, Grandma sat quietly in her bedroom watching an old television show. I stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment. For years, she had protected everyone in this family. Now it was my turn to protect her. And once the legal papers were filed, the quiet tension inside that house would explode into a full war. The morning after I told the lawyer to move forward with the case, the house felt different. Not quieter, heavier. Like the air inside the walls knew something was about to happen. Raymond sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while Denise flipped through a magazine. Neither of them spoke when I walked in. But both of them looked up, watching, measuring, trying to read something in my face. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across the table. So, Denise said after a moment, have you decided how long you're staying in Cedar Ridge? Her tone sounded polite, but there was an edge beneath it. Not sure yet, I replied. Raymond stirred his coffee slowly. Well, he said, small towns can get boring if you stay too long. I met his eyes. I'll manage. The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside to get some air. From the porch, I could see the entire yard. The oak tree still stood in the corner where it always had. The fence my grandfather built was still holding together despite the years. This place had been the center of our family for decades, and Raymond was preparing to sell it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from my lawyer. We're preparing the filing. I'll need a few more documents. I walked down the steps and paced slowly across the yard while we spoke on the phone. We'll challenge the property transfer based on several factors, he explained. Your grandmother's medical condition, the misuse of power of attorney, and the questionable witness. And the development company, I asked. That strengthens the argument that your uncle had financial motives. So what happens when you file? He'll receive official notice, the lawyer said. And after that, the situation will likely escalate. Escalate. That was one way to describe it. When I walked back toward the house, I noticed something unexpected. A black SUV was parked in the driveway beside Raymond's truck. A man in a suit stood on the porch speaking with Raymond. They stopped talking when they saw me. The man nodded politely. Good afternoon, he said. Raymond didn't introduce him. Instead, he turned slightly to block the folder the man was holding. But I had already seen the label printed across the front. Development proposal. The man shook Raymond's hand and walked back to the SUV. Within seconds, the vehicle disappeared down Maple Street. Raymond turned toward me slowly. Friend of yours? I asked. Business, he replied shortly. What kind of business? He smiled without warmth. The kind that doesn't concern you. Inside the house, Denise was standing near the kitchen doorway. You shouldn't eavesdrop on conversations that aren't meant for you, she said. I wasn't eavesdropping, I replied. I was standing in my grandmother's yard. Her smile tightened. Well, you won't be here forever. That night I heard something else that made my blood run cold. Denise and Raymond were arguing in the kitchen after Grandma had gone upstairs. The hallway was dark, but their voices carried clearly. We can't keep her here much longer, Denise said. She's getting confused again. So, Raymond replied. So it'll look bad if we sell the house while she's still living in it. There was a pause. Then Denise lowered her voice. There's a facility outside of town. Assisted living. The words felt like ice sliding down my spine. You want to move her out? Raymond asked. It's the easiest solution, Denise said. Once she's gone, the sale becomes simple. I stepped away from the hallway before they could notice me listening. Move her out. Sell the house. Everything they were doing suddenly felt even colder. The next morning, the black SUV returned. This time, the suited man walked inside the house with Raymond. They spread several papers across the dining table. I stayed in the living room, pretending to read while listening carefully. "Timeline is important," the man said. "The development project begins next spring." Raymond nodded. "Once the property clears legally." "We're ready." Legally. The word almost made me laugh. After the man left, Raymond gathered the papers into a folder and carried them into the den. For a moment he left the folder sitting on the table. Just long enough? I walked past the dining room slowly and glanced down. The top page showed a map. Our house. The neighboring properties. Highlighted sections marked for future construction. Retail complex? Parking structures. Restaurants. I took out my phone and quickly snapped 2 photos before continuing down the hallway. My heart was pounding. Later that afternoon, I sent the images to my lawyer. He called back within minutes. "This confirms their financial motive," he said. "The property is a key part of the development area." "So what now?" I asked. "We file the challenge tomorrow." That night, the tension inside the house was impossible to ignore. Raymond barely looked at me. Denise whispered on the phone in the other room. And upstairs, my grandmother slept quietly, unaware that the home she had built was about to become the center of a legal battle. I sat alone in the living room long after everyone went to bed. The old staircase creaked softly as the house settled into the night. For the first time since I came back to Cedar Ridge, I felt something stronger than anger. Determination. Because by tomorrow morning, Raymond would receive official legal notice. And when that happened, the quiet war inside this house would finally begin. The certified letter arrived just after breakfast. I heard the mail truck stop outside and watched through the living room window as the driver walked up the front steps. He knocked once and handed Raymond a thick envelope that required a signature. Raymond looked annoyed at first, but as he opened the envelope and began reading the documents inside, his expression slowly changed. The color drained from his face. Denise leaned closer. "What is it?" she asked. Raymond didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved quickly across the pages before he slowly lifted his head and looked directly at me. "You did this," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but the anger inside it was impossible to miss. I set my coffee cup down on the table. "What are you talking about?" I asked calmly. He threw the papers onto the table. Legal documents spread across the surface. A formal challenge to the property transfer. My lawyer's name printed clearly at the top. "You're accusing me of fraud," Raymond said. "I'm asking the court to review how the house was transferred," I replied. Denise stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This is unbelievable," she said. "You show up after years away and suddenly you're trying to steal the house." "Steal," I said. Raymond's hand slammed against the table. "She signed the papers," he shouted. Everything was legal. The noise brought my grandmother slowly down the stairs. She stood at the edge of the room looking confused. "What's going on?" she asked. Raymond immediately tried to calm his voice. "Nothing, Mom," he said. "Just a misunderstanding." I stepped toward her. "Grandma," I said gently. "The lawyers are reviewing the house documents." Raymond turned on me. "You're scaring her," he snapped. But Grandma looked past him. Her eyes settled on the papers spread across the table. "Did I give you the house?" she asked Raymond quietly. The room fell silent. Raymond hesitated. Denise stepped forward quickly. "Of course she did," she said. But Grandma kept looking at Raymond. Waiting. He finally shrugged. "You signed the paperwork," he said. Grandma frowned slightly. "I don't remember that," she whispered. Raymond turned away from her and grabbed the papers off the table. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Later that afternoon, I met my lawyer again at his office. He already knew Raymond had received the notice. "That was the first step," he said. "What happens next?" I asked. "We present evidence showing the transfer may not be valid." He opened a folder and slid several documents across the desk. Medical records from Grandma's hospital stay. Statements confirming the medications she had been given during recovery. These records suggest she may not have been fully capable of understanding legal documents at that time, he explained. "And the witness?" I asked. He smiled slightly. That's where things become even more interesting. The man who signed as a witness on the property transfer had been contacted. According to the lawyer, he wasn't a notary or a legal professional. He was a friend of Raymond's. Did he watch Grandma sign the document? I asked. Not exactly, the lawyer said. That evening, the news had already started spreading through Cedar Ridge. In a small town, secrets don't stay hidden for long. Mrs. Collins stopped me outside the grocery store. I heard there's a dispute over your grandmother's house, she said quietly. I nodded. She wasn't herself when she was in the hospital. Mrs. Collins continued. I remember Raymond bringing papers in and out of that room. Her words only strengthened my resolve. When I returned home that night, Denise approached me in the hallway. Her expression was different. Less angry. More calculating. We should talk, she said. I crossed my arms. What about resolving this situation peacefully? I didn't respond. She lowered her voice. You know that development project coming to Cedar Ridge? Yes. There's a lot of money involved, she said. Her eyes moved briefly toward the living room where Raymond was watching television. If you drop the legal challenge, she continued, there will be money for everyone. I stared at her. You're offering to pay me to stay quiet. I'm offering a solution, she replied. This house belongs to my grandmother, I said. Denise's polite smile vanished. You're making a mistake. Maybe. But the next phone call I received confirmed something important. My lawyer spoke quickly. We interviewed the witness on the transfer document, and he admitted he didn't actually watch your grandmother sign anything. My heart skipped. What do you mean? He said Raymond asked him to sign afterward, without proper witnessing. The document's legitimacy was suddenly questionable. That night, the house felt like a battlefield. Raymond stayed in his office most of the evening making phone calls. Denise whispered angrily on her cell phone in the kitchen. Upstairs, my grandmother sat quietly in her bedroom watching television. I sat alone in the living room staring at the staircase. The truth about the property transfer was finally starting to surface. But the court hadn't ruled yet. And until the final decision came, the future of this house and my grandmother's home was still hanging in the balance. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge was smaller than I remembered. A single brick building with wide wooden doors and tall windows that let the morning sunlight spill into the hallway. I stood beside my lawyer outside the courtroom, holding a folder of documents while my heart beat harder than I expected. Across the hall, Raymond sat with his attorney. Denise sat beside him, arms crossed tightly against her chest. Neither of them looked at me. For the first time since I returned to town, Raymond didn't look confident. He looked tired. The clerk opened the courtroom door and called our case. We walked inside together. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the overhead lights. A few people from town had taken seats in the back row. In a place like Cedar Ridge, a family dispute over property was enough to attract attention. Raymond sat at the opposite table from me. The judge reviewed the case file for several minutes before speaking. This hearing concerns the legal transfer of property located on Maple Street, he said. My lawyer stood and began presenting the evidence. First came the hospital records. Documents showing that my grandmother had been recovering from surgery when the transfer papers were signed. Medical notes describing the medication she had been receiving at the time. The judge read them carefully. Then my lawyer presented the power of attorney document. Raymond had been given temporary authority to manage financial matters while Grandma recovered. But the document clearly stated that it did not authorize permanent property transfers. Raymond's lawyer tried to interrupt. This transfer was signed voluntarily, he argued. My lawyer slid the next document across the table. The property transfer itself. And this, he said calmly, is where the situation becomes questionable. He pointed to the signature at the bottom. The shaky handwriting. Then he placed a second document beside it. An older form with my grandmother's normal signature. The difference between the two was obvious even from across the room. The judge leaned forward slightly. Finally came the most important part. The witness testimony. The man who had signed the document as the official witness had already given a statement. My lawyer read it aloud. The man admitted he had not actually seen my grandmother sign the papers. He had signed afterward, at Raymond's request. The courtroom became completely silent. Raymond shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His lawyer tried one last argument. "This was a misunderstanding," he said, but the damage had already been done. The judge reviewed the documents one final time before speaking. "The court finds that the property transfer was not properly executed," he said. The words felt unreal at first, due to the questionable circumstances surrounding the signing, the misuse of power of attorney, and the unreliable witness verification. The transfer is declared invalid. I felt the tension leave my shoulders all at once. Ownership of the house returned legally to my grandmother. Raymond said nothing. Denise's face had gone pale. Within minutes, the hearing was over. Outside the courthouse, Raymond walked past me without saying a word. Denise followed him quickly. I never saw them look back. The following week felt like watching the house slowly breathe again. Raymond and Denise packed their belongings and left. The rooms that had once felt tense and unfamiliar started returning to the way they used to be. Grandma and I moved the furniture back into its old places. The family photos returned to the hallway walls. My grandfather's picture went back above the fireplace where it had always belonged. Even the garden outside began to look better. We trimmed the roses together one afternoon, just like we used to when I was younger, for the first time since I arrived. The house felt like home again. One evening we sat together on the front porch as the sun lowered behind the trees. Grandma held my hand quietly. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For what?" I asked. "For not remembering everything?" I squeezed her hand gently. "You trusted someone you loved," I said. "That's not something to be ashamed of." She looked toward the garden. "This house has always meant so much to our family." "I know," I said, "and it still does." Later that night, I walked through the kitchen alone. The same kitchen where I had first seen her scrubbing the floor. The memory still stung, but now the room felt peaceful again. The silence was different. Not heavy, just quiet. Standing there, I realized something important. Sometimes the worst betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from inside our own families. But silence only allows those betrayals to grow. Speaking up, fighting back, even when it's uncomfortable, can restore the dignity someone else tried to take away. And in this case, it gave my grandmother her home back. If you've ever witnessed something like this in your own family, where someone vulnerable was taken advantage of or treated unfairly, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments. And if you believe standing up for the people who once protected us is always worth it, make sure you stay with the channel and subscribe for more stories like this. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't anger. It's justice.